Hello everybody. Today I'd like to tell you about this really beautiful Norman Lindsay watercolour. It's called Nude in a Summer Hat and it was painted by Norman Lindsay in 1940. It's a really special addition to my stock in my art studio at the moment, so I wanted to take a little bit of extra time to tell you a little bit about how beautiful this painting is. Well, as I said, it was painted in 1940. That was a really significant year in Norman Lindsay's life, because unfortunately it was a year of tragedy for Norman Lindsay. His wife Rose took a beautiful bundle of Norman Lindsay's best watercolours that he'd painted over about 20 years to America with the hope to have them published so that they could produce beautiful prints of Norman's works. But unfortunately, en route to New York, the paintings were destroyed, most of them in a train fire. So it was an absolute tragedy, and Rose never really fully recovered from that incident. But when she returned back to Australia to tell Norman the dreadful news, he was so good-natured about it, and he said, "Don't worry, love, I'll paint you some more." Which is, I think that's just so typical of Norman, and he was such a hard-working artist as well. So what is intriguing about this particular picture is that we don't know for sure whether it was one of the surviving works of watercolours of Norman Lindsay from 1940, or whether it was one of those lovely ones that Norman may have painted for Rose after the fire. However, all of that aside, it's actually a very beautiful work by Norman Lindsay, and for a number of reasons that I'd like to explain today. Firstly, and very obviously, the colour. It's very, very beautiful. Most people adore blue, and I think it's really lovely that Norman has chosen that as his central colour scheme in this picture. The other thing that's really important when you're buying a work, particularly a watercolour by a famous artist, and especially if you're going to be spending a significant amount of money to buy a collectible piece, is that the work must be in good condition. And we can say this without any reservation about this beautiful painting. You can see how crisp and clear the colour is, there's no fading, and it's in immaculate condition. Sometimes watercolours suffer from foxing, which is where you get like little brown marks all over the surface of the work. And that's something that continues to grow in the painting, but this, as you can see, it's just in immaculate condition. And then the subject matter is obviously the thing that we're most drawn to. It's a beautiful lyrical scene. Norman Lindsay talked about something in his watercolours in terms of how he used to like to frame the picture and create beautiful harmonious lines and shapes, and he talked about paintings having to have a dominant angle. And in this case, because the painting is because the figure is standing upright, the dominant angle here really is a triangular shape, because the figure takes that shape in the middle, and all the other shapes around the picture follow that principle with sort of, you can kind of see it comes out like that, like it radiates like this. And that's Norman Lindsay's great skill as a painter. We get very seduced looking at the beauty of the painting, but it's very nice to know that Norman had a really good brain and used to love to work out how to do these watercolours beautifully. The other thing I think you might like to know is how Norman actually created his watercolours. It was a very skillful technique and required great courage and a fair amount of risk. So what he would do, he would always do a very detailed drawing first on a piece of paper separate to the artwork, and it was generally a thin piece of paper, and then he would blacken that on the background, and then with his etching needle he would lay it carefully over the top of the paper that was going to become the watercolour, and then he would needle in very, very delicately the pencil lines so that you aren't even really aware of them once the watercolour goes over the top. And the idea is to keep it very fresh and very clean without seeing grey pencil marks. And then he would mix a solution generally of a pale yellow watercolour with lots of water and lay it on top of the surface, and that's called a wash. And great watercolour artists do this technique, and then what they do is then they drop in very, very carefully in a very well thought out sequence the other pigments, which are the other colours, and they let those pigments settle into the wash and spread naturally over the surface of the wash and then dry into the paper and into that wash. Now the trick is not to muddy it with your paintbrush. If you do that, the colours lose their luminosity, and then what happens is when we look at it, painting's not full of beautiful light and beautiful colour. And when you consider how quickly a painting or a watercolour painting dries, it's actually amazing that Norman Lindsay would even undertake something that risky. And he did say, because he was absolute perfectionist, that of every 4 watercolours that he began, he would generally get rid of 3 of them because he was so particular about them having to be lovely quality. So that's this lovely watercolour, Nude in a Summer Hat. You can see it's beautifully presented, and it's gorgeous gold leaf frame from the period. It's all been beautifully restored, the frame, and it's also, the painting's protected with a UV resistant glass, so the colour will remain beautiful on this forever. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed learning about this lovely painting.